if you ever need to take your tires off, you don't have an air compressor, this is what you need right here. Brushless 20-volt lithium ion. Cat's ass. I think my battery's about there. I got a spare. Okay. Oh, big old 35 off here. Now, as you can see, there's some surface rust on the brake rotor. This is normal. Vehicle sets too long. See where it was, where the pad's set. That's no big deal. That'll come right off. You can see the pad material here. You can see how thin it is. It's almost down to the rivets. So what'll happen is if you keep driving this, that pad material will wear down to where the metal head of the rivet will actually contact the rotor. The rivet is what is used to hold the actual friction material to the backing plate of the pad. So what'll happen is that'll usually starts grinding first, and then it gets so thin that the backing material, the friction material, starts to flake off, and it just all falls off. So then you're literally left with nothing but the metal backing plate against the rotor. And I've seen them so bad that it'll actually wear the backing plate out, to where either the backing plate gets so small it literally just falls out, or it just wears away, and then it will literally, you grind the piston caliper, or the caliper piston, excuse me, into the rotor itself. So now these rotors here, they're integral with the hub in the four-wheel drive. It has worn manual locking hubs on it. I have no pulsation out of these, so I'm not going to change them right now. I'm going to do what they call in the industry a pad slap, where basically I just put new pads on these older rotors. It's not the ideal way to do it, but you know, for a weekend toy, it's no big deal. So you can see right there, you can see from this thing's been set, and this truck is set for quite a bit, so it doesn't get driven much at all. I bought this truck off my sister and her husband. They had it for about 13 years, and I think they probably put less than 4,000 miles on it in 13 years. So it's set for quite a while, but you can see it's pretty rust free. So it's a nice, clean, solid truck. But today I'm going to show you guys how to do a brake job. Okay. Now, on most of your GM rear-wheel drive platforms, like your trucks, your older trucks, and your cars, almost all the caliper bolts, caliper pins are a 3/8 hex. Oh, yeah, them puppies are tight. You can see the 3/8 Allen head. This is what they call the slider sleeve. This is the slider that goes over the bolt. The bolt sets in there, and then the caliper slides on this pin. This pin allows it to slide. There's a rubber O-ring inside the caliper. This pin will actually slide, and it lets the caliper slide. See, there's your pad material I was talking about. Probably about a 1/16 of an inch or less before it was going to start grinding. So, and another thing you want to look at is you want to make sure the pad material is actually wearing even. You can see this one is probably about a 32 of an inch off. This end here, furthest away from me, is thinner than the end closest to me. And what will usually cause that, especially on the outer pad, is a issue where the caliper brake hardware is binding up and seizing up, and it's not letting the caliper move, or only one end of it is moving, and it's causing the caliper and pad to rock like that, so it'll wear uneven. A lot of times you'll see this outer pad will be completely wore down to metal, and the inner pad will still be thick. Now this one's pretty even. It's a little bit thicker, but I've seen a lot of them where the inner pad's nice and thick yet, and the outer is completely wore out because that caliper hardware bound up and it held that outer pad against. You still had the inner pad moving back and forth like it was supposed to, but the caliper wasn't sliding, so it was just destroying that outer pad. Never want to let your caliper hang by the hose. So, alrighty. If this wasn't just a play toy, I would clean this up with some sandpaper, and I still may put rotors on this when I get it to work. But right now here in my driveway, I don't want to tear the four-wheel drive hubs down, and I do plan on doing a video later on where I show you how to actually take the locking hubs off and take the whole hub assembly off and change the bearings and seals in here. But that's just not anything I want to get into in my driveway right here. So, okay. Now, we have to push that caliper piston back. A lot of guys do this different ways. Some guys, before they take the caliper off, they'll put a pry bar in there. And in between the pad and the rotor, and they'll actually pry it back like this. That'll work. Some guys will take it off and they'll leave the inner pad in, and they'll put a C-clamp and they'll squeeze it and force it back. I use one of these. This one's made by Blue Point, but there's several other companies that make them. It's a ratcheting pad expander. I'll show you. Make sure I get it going the right way. You want to try to keep that centered in that piston so the piston goes in evenly. As you can see how easy that's going back, because you've got the mechanical leverage of the threaded mechanism in here that's pushing on it, so it's actually multiplying your force. It doesn't take near as much of force on some of these. Nope. Come on. There we go. It's hard to hold this where the camera can see one-handed, but right there you go. Now you can see that caliper piston goes all the way in. A bunch of debris in there. It's probably been 15 years since this thing's had brake pads put on it. So if you see any tears in this seal, you either want to rebuild or replace the caliper, because what happens is over time water and dirt will ingress inside that seal, and it will get between the piston and the caliper bore, and it will either cause it to leak or it'll cause it to bind up. I've seen calipers locked up solid where even this tool will not budge them because they've gotten rust in between the piston and the bore. So, and also, if you got one, the seal's not damaged at all and it looks fine like this one does, and it still doesn't want to push back, what will happen most times is this rubber hose will actually start to deteriorate inside, and it'll start to flake off little pieces of rubber or you'll get rust from the lines or contamination in the system, and it gets blown down the line into the caliper. Well, the caliper sets like this, so it all sinks to the bottom. And I've actually tore calipers apart where they were all just full of rust halfway up the bore, and there was just no physical way you could push them back because you were trying to compress the rust that was inside the caliper. So if you get one that will not go back, stop. Don't try to force it, because you can't force it back. And even if you do, it's probably going to stay locked up. You're going to cause yourself more problems and destroy your new brakes. You're better off just putting a new caliper on it. Calipers are cheap for something like this. I mean, this caliper is probably 15 bucks at the parts store, so it's just not worth the hassle. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take these bolts. We're going to go in on my grinder, my bench grinder, and we'll clean them up. I got to find another sleeve. But what I'll do is I'll take the rust off of them and make them all nice and shiny. And then we'll use some special high temp caliper grease and lube everything up. That way everything stays free and moving. Now when you work with one of these, you don't ever want to wear gloves or rings or anything like that. It can get caught in the wheel, because it will take a part out of your hand and throw it back at you faster than you can even blink. So, sorry my garage is a mess. I've been out. Been busy doing other stuff. Now, I'm not using the grinding side of it. I'm using the wire wheel that I have mounted to it. You want to make sure you use a special wire wheel that's rated for the RPM that these turns. It doesn't take a lot of force. You just let the wire wheel do the work. But you can see the difference from that to that. So all we're doing is just taking that rust off. We're not grinding on it, we're just taking that rust off. Now you can see the difference between those two. This rust is what binds up in that O-ring that's inside that caliper. It doesn't let it slide. So you lube this up now and that'll slide much easier. It won't cause any binding. We're going to do the same thing to these bolts now. Get the biggest part of that rust off. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you definitely want to make sure the threads are nice and clean. That way you don't cross thread into the spindle on the axle, because then you have to tap it, re-thread it. That's a big hassle. now it'll slide on there a lot easier. There's nothing to bind it up.
Generally, these don't get too much build up inside, but if you get one where it's got a lot of rust build up in there, you can get the hardware kit to replace all these. It comes with the new O-rings, the sliders. Some of the kits even come with the new caliper bolts for like $10. So I'm not going to do it because, as you can see right in there, they're still nice and clean. So okay, now I'm using Napa premium pads. These are what I use at the shop. They're a really good pad. They come with the shims on them, and they come with hardware. If it uses the stamped stainless steel kind of hardware, it'll come with it. These do come with the anti-rattle clips. You always want to change these. What this does is this clips on to the inner pad. I'll show you here when I go put it together. These clip onto the inner pad, and they keep the pad retained inside the piston so it doesn't rattle. That's how they get their name, Anti-Rattle Clip. As you can see right there, they got a nice shim on them. These are glued, these are not riveted. I prefer the glued ones because the riveted ones, they grind easier. And the old days, a lot of guys didn't like the bonded ones. They're called bonded, not glued. A lot of guys didn't like the bonded pads because the pad material would actually be prone to falling off the backing plate. Like, you would have a brake pad that was not much more worn than this, and it would just fall off the backing plate. But they've come a long way with their resins and their glues, and that's just not an issue anymore. And here's the outer. You can see how it sets right there, and the caliper pins go through it. Okay, you can see the anti-rattle clip right here. It just clips onto the pad. They gave us a couple different sizes. There's two different sizes. There's a bigger one and a smaller one. And you can see this is the same size. It's designed so it springs out a little bit, so it helps keep that pad retention. So, okay. Here's what I use this at the shop, and I use it here at home. It's the Permatex Ceramic Extreme Brake Parts Lubricant. Now, it claims 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not going to be willing to test that, but I've never had an issue with it liquefying and going elsewhere where it shouldn't. It stays in place. The biggest thing with caliper grease, and really any kind of grease on your brake system, is you don't want to use too much of it. A lot of guys, I'll see them slap that stuff on everywhere, and the more you slap on, the more area you give for brake dust, metal particles, or even grit and sand off the road to get collected in that grease and then get pulled into the friction points on the brake system, and that can cause issues too. Sometimes if you do use too much of it, it will get slung around and end up in places where it shouldn't be. You especially don't want to get it on your brake rotor surface or your pad surface, because then it can cause all kinds of nuisance noises and stuff like that. So, but it's really good stuff. You can see there it's purple, so it makes it easy to see where you got it. Okay. Now we'll take a new inner pad. And we will take I gotta kind of stretch it. Come on, you little bugger. Sometimes you can go that way, and sometimes you go this way. There we go. See how that clips on there? Now, the way you want to do it, you always want to make sure this is down towards the bottom of the pad, so it pushes up, so it helps keep the pad in the caliper. Otherwise, if you put this up here, it pushes down and it doesn't want to stay as good. So, Okay, now before I go any further, what did I do with that? Okay, here we go. Here comes the damn neighbor of his diesel. Okay, there's just way too much on there. So we'll just take some of this and we'll smear it. Once again, doesn't need to be a lot. You don't have to use half the bottle. Let me slide that in there. Now I'm probably going to end up tearing this back apart when I get it to the shop to change them O-rings, because you can see there's a little bit of play in there, but it's still not bad. If those O-rings are totally gone, what will happen is that caliper will rattle on the pins. This will sit here and rattle back and forth because there's no cushion. All those O-rings are in there for is to act like a cushion and to keep it from rattling. Okay. Once again, doesn't have to be a lot. Now you'll see the pad. Turn this where you can see it. You'll see what I was talking about, where it pushes down, or it pushes it up. And see how it retains that pad inside the caliper. And I always point the squealers towards the upside. I see guys do it either way. I've done it either way. I'm sure there's a reason why it matters. But I've never had an issue. I just always do them up. Okay. Now, here we're going to see two more friction points. Right here and right here. This is where the caliper slides. What I use to clean them up is I just use a steel universal little, like a toothbrush. I'll just hit those real quick. And we'll go to the caliper. You can just hit it real quick. These aren't bad, so it doesn't take a lot. Okay. And here, once again, use this stuff sparingly. Doesn't take a lot, just a light little coat. Okay. Now, I lube the pins. I don't lube the whole pin. There's really no need to lube it beyond, here to here. Lube the end of it and lube it right about here. And you can even put some on the threads if you want to help keep the threads lubricated. But there you go. Now normally, I would recommend starting both caliper bolts before you tighten them down. But with this style setup, it still gives you plenty of play. You can still get them lined up. And there you go. Now there is one last thing before you put the wheel on. It helps if you have an assistant. What you do is you have somebody in there, you pump the brakes up. That way the piston comes all the way out and it compresses the pad and everything's nice and tight. And you have them keep the brakes applied. And then I take a hammer, a pry bar, and I'll pry the pad up like this, and then I will take a hammer and sometimes a chisel and smack these down, and that keeps the pad from rattling like that. It keeps that pad gripped onto the caliper also. So when the caliper moves, the pad isn't free to ride up against the rotor, it gets pulled back off also. So a lot of people overlook that step, and then they can't figure out every time they hit a bump, they get that noise. So let's go in and pump those brakes up. I of course didn't bring a hammer or a chisel home with me, so I'm going to improvise with the claw hammer and a socket extension. Not ideal, but it will get the job done. You just have to have 3 hands. Okay. Now, there's still a little movement on that one. So, press it some more, beat it again. Where it helps to have a partner, but you can get it done by yourself. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, this side is done. Other side to go. We're done with the front brakes, and then we can move on to the rear drum brakes.